disperse immediately or you will be subject to arrest. Do it now.
A boss ain't nothing but a thief on a time loan. 128-bit war, you play Nintendo. On some shooter, so put the bridge down, don't feed us to the killer bees. We get what we deserve, like bury me with my MP3s. Write my manifesto in 72 DPI. Life's just a game, you got cheated, never learned. I write these songs for every bridge that ain't been burned, for every cop car that ain't been turned.
Renee with Heater Block Spokane.
I'm AC. I'm with Heater Block Philly.
And I'm Leif. I'm with Heater Block Spokane.
Tell us what Heater Block is and how did you get involved in this and why?
I guess I'll go first on that one. I got the knowledge from Portland, comrades in Portland, and it showed up on my feed on Twitter about Heater Block, and I clicked on there and I read their design on how to build one, and they encouraged us to go out and build for our communities. And I ran it over with my, comrade here in Spokane, and we decided to put our great minds together, and we started out with a little bit of our funds, and then we started fundraising for to build more, and it was a success. People love it. They're calling us the heater people out here. It's funny. So yeah, this is how we got started as Heater Block, and we came across Heater Block Philly, and we're like, yeah, it's going to the east from the west. We love it. So we got the knowledge from design from the original Heater Block, which are our comrades out in Portland. They got so many designs for so many things. So we're just expanding the knowledge over here to Spokane, and we got the knowledge, and we are using our hands, and we're building it ourselves here.
I'll go in regards to how the Philly Heater Block started. We learned it from Portland because Portland is the original creator of this absolutely life-saving invention. And when we saw it, immediately we were like, this needs to be here. And at the end of the day, you can't wait for someone to do something that you want to be done. So we looked at each other and we said, we want this here. Let's make it happen. And we also began with our own funds. And from there, we also started fundraising to get supplies.
Which is added to our, the movement of mutual aid. It's not an organization or a charity. It's just simply like-minded folks who believe in same things and take care of each other. We believe that we take care of each other, and we're not going to depend on our oppressors to take care of us. So we wanted that here, like Heater Block Philly said. We had to have it here in Spokane because we're getting very, very, cold weather here. And it's dropping even colder here. Like the Texas freeze weather is pretty insane. So we're trying to do our best to get out there to help keep folks warm who have to sleep outside in these unlikely conditions that no one should have to be subjected to. So that's why we're here doing Heater Block.
Yeah, and just to add a little bit to what Renee said about our starting point here in Spokane. A week ago, we were sitting at an encampment that had formed outside of City Hall in Spokane, and we were there most of the night. And we had this little dinky can with some hand sanitizer and a little paper in it that was supposed to be keeping us warm, and we weren't feeling any heat off of it. And then one of the guys that was camped out there, he took that thing in his tent, and within 5 minutes the whole tent had smoke coming out of it. And I said, Phil, what are you doing? You burn yourself? And he's like, I put plastic in it, man. I'm like, get out of there. And then the next morning, they had gotten swept out of that space, and I texted Renee just absolutely irate and losing my mind. And I told her, I don't remember everything I said, but it was a whole lot of I hate everything and everyone in the world right now, and I need to go pass out for a little bit. I need to turn off the world because I'm that mad. And she texted me back and reminded me that I wasn't alone in the world. And then I went and passed out. And then a few hours later, I woke up with a bunch of messages from her on my phone, with that PDF about this heater block setup, and with the question, you want to make heaters? And I was like, yeah, hell yeah, I want to make heaters. And she's like, well, we got to get the supplies. I'm like, I'm going to go buy those right now. Next morning I got up, worked a few hours to make a little money, and we went out and we made the first couple, and then we're up to about 25. I just bought enough supplies to make another 84 right now, so we're moving pretty good with them.
For us to have 25 heaters go out already, and it already is on the front page of the newspaper. Like, folks are like helping. Like, this is helping folks. Like, folks are actually giving us live feedback. We're spending time out there with them. We're not just dropping it off. We're actually getting to know them. We're showing them how it's, how you can maintain the heat from it and how to keep it safely lit. We're dropping off fuel and lighters to make sure that they have that as well, because, without the fuel, you can't have the heater working. So, and we don't want them putting in oil and, plastic and stuff like that, like they were doing. So
we had someone put oil in one of those things a couple days ago. They ran out of the fuel, and before I could get back with more, he tried putting vegetable oil in there, and I get there and he's like, yeah, so I put oil in it, it didn't work. I was like, I know it didn't work. It's designed for alcohol, man. But these things are so durable that I was able to sit there and I was able to clean that up with more alcohol. I was able to get that oil out of there on the tailgate of my pickup, and it lit right back up and is right back in service. So
yeah, pretty exciting.
And the article you're talking about is in the Spokane Spokesman Review. Okay.
Yeah. It was an unhoused neighbor showing off the heater that we gave them. So that made us happy, even though they didn't specifically quote heater block, which is cool. I'm not out here to get recognition or be anybody's, leader or anything like that. I'm just happy to see that it was photoed on the page, and, that made me feel like, yay, this is helping other folks, for them to want to go out and show, the media what we gave them. Just warmed my heart so much. So.
And we've only been at it for about a week too, so it's making a big difference real fast. So
a week, yeah, not even been out here that long doing the heaters. So
I know it's kind of hard to describe constructing one of these things over this medium, but in general, just kind of like tell us about what these heaters are. What it takes to create one. Is this an expensive thing? Is this easy to make?
I think I want to answer the last question first about how easy they are to make.
Right.
So the heater block for Philly, we are all physically disabled. And so I will definitely say this has been very challenging for us, trying to build these. So I would say depending upon the person, the difficulty level will vary. And I don't think that should intimidate people. We created a Zine actually on building hacks for people with disabilities to make it easier. But yeah, so I just want to answer that part. And since Spokane is just pushing ahead, I'm going to let them answer how they're building because they're cruising.
Yeah, I mean, and
the guy, my comrade Lace can definitely go in full detail about that. But the hacks are definitely useful, and it also recognized that folks who do have disabilities are not excluded from, being able to contribute because of their disability. So we appreciate you, Heater Block Philly, for making that hack for sure.
Yeah, and I to go off of what Heater Block Philly was saying there, I've been a lifelong mechanic and a carpenter, and I've got a lot of different skill sets that are very useful for putting these things together. And it is hard. They're not easy, and physically it's exhausting to put them together. Also, they're costing us, I think, $10 to $15 a piece to put them together. I haven't done the actual math yet, but it's somewhere in that $10 range, I think. But basically, you're looking at a 8-ounce mason jar that, and then you're taking some 1/4-inch copper tubing, refrigeration tubing, and you're putting salt in there so that when you bend it, it doesn't collapse on you. And then you're wrapping that around like a 1-inch like a 1-inch dowel, wooden dowel is what we're using. And that part's not easy. Like that's not, it takes quite a bit of force. And I'm strong. Like I said, I got mechanic hands too. I do this kind of stuff. I've been doing it my whole life. But it takes quite a bit of force to get that around there. And making sure that it's getting bent right without kinking or anything. And then you're putting that, that wrapped coil, that copper coil that you've created, you're drilling holes and putting that in through the mason jar, through the lid of the mason jar, and you're sealing that up with JB Weld. And then we've been putting that onto a aluminum pie plate is what we're using for the base. We found that to be one, it doesn't conduct heat. Two, it doesn't break. It's pretty durable. So that's been working pretty well. And then you're just using 1/2-inch hardware mesh, like chicken wire, to build a cage that goes around, and a 6-inch terracotta pot is going right on the top. And then we've been having, with the temperatures and the drafting inside the tents here, we discovered pretty quickly on the very first one that we tried to take out there that we need to have a heat shield around it too. So we've been using aluminum foil to create a heat shield, and we're just wrapping that around the wire mesh cage with an opening in the back to vent it a little bit when they start to burn a little too hot. But it's a lot of work. They're not easy. They're not expensive to do really, but the biggest cost becomes the fuel. The alcohol isn't cheap, and we got to get a lot of that out there. We go out there every day and give them more alcohol. And right now it's coming largely out of our pocket. We've been getting some donations, and we're getting out there and trying to get more. But it's been a lot, but it's working, and it's making people warm. So.
And one of the ideas behind this is that it's physically hard or impossible for stuff like in somebody's tent or their encampment to catch fire with this thing, or. We've
tested that quite a bit. I've worked pretty hard to set a tent on fire out where I'm working on it. I've gotten them good and hot. That it's the terracotta pot on top. That's the part that gets hot. The cage, and the base, none of that heats up. It's all aluminum, or galvanized steel, and none of that heats up. So you got that terracotta pot, which is ceramic, that gets pretty hot. But I've taken that, fully heated up, a couple hours running, and I've, pressed that up against tents and on the bases and blankets and things like that. And nowhere near to the point where you have to worry about anything catching on fire. You might get a little melting, but I haven't even gotten that much of that either when I've been testing it. So, and the ceramic pots, they cool off really fast if they were to tip over, they cool off really fast, especially in the cold environments out here. So they've proven to be really safe.
They're more like a thermal mass, so for the terracotta pots. So that's more like a thermal mass where it helps radiate and put off the heat. So that's the reason why the terracotta pots were chosen to be used for that. And also, we tested it out in the car. I tested it out in my car. My car is a pretty huge space, so I had to wrap some blankets around my chairs, my seats, and wrap it around me, and I placed the heater on my base floor, and the heat just shot right up, and it was able to keep me warm. I slept for 5 hours with that thing on, so and I woke up. The fire was literally still lit. It was a little bit of fuel left. I just had to fill it up once, and I slept for 5 hours in my car.
And when they tip over, the flame goes out instantly. When they get to about 90 degrees, the flame goes out instantly. It gets flooded with the alcohol inside the tube. It goes, and we've tested that a lot too. It goes out immediately, so there's very little risk of the flame ever touching anything.
And the way we tested ours out in Philly, we tested it outside, and then we're building it. We have somebody's apartment space. That's what we have to work with. So it's one room, and we also tested it inside the apartment to see, was it gonna set off the smoke alarm? Was it gonna, what was the impact? And the smoke alarm did not go off, and nothing caught fire in the apartment. We just wanted to see, like, how many spaces can this be placed in? How safe is it? And it seems like pretty much everywhere it has been utilized in, it has been successful in not creating a fire hazard.
Yeah, and our neighbors out there who we passed the heaters out to, they gave us their feedback, and they love it. Like, they literally love it. Every time we pull up, they run to our car and they'll ask us for heaters. One guy wanted 2 heaters for his tent. I mean, we would have loved to give him 2 heaters, but like you said, like Life said, that it's only 2 of us, one of us doing most of the building. And, so it's time consuming and it is a lot of work and can be a little exhausting. But, with the support from all our comrades out here and, making us feel like, they see that we can actually make this happen for Spokane, and their support is keeping us going for sure.
And I'm building these right now in a 10 by 10 shed also. So we're working in pretty tight spaces also. And I've had like 10 of those things burn at a time in there too. I had to turn off all my other heaters because with 10 of those going, it was all the heat I need in my little shed.
So why is it important that a project like this exists? One
of the unfortunate reasons it's important is because, we are anti-fascist, obviously, so we don't support the government. In the same token, the government is causing, our neighbors to suffer in these horrible, horrible conditions. And it's up to the community to find solutions. And this is a solution. Not like a solution, but this is a step in the right direction to create a better living situation these living situations should not exist regardless, but it's important that we do what we can with what we have to make it at least more bearable so that people can at least survive. Because too many homeless people already this month have passed away because of exposure. So, if the more this spreads, the less people are going to lose their lives. So.
Agreed. And this is so important to us here in Spokane because, we do have a lot of unhoused neighbors out here and they get swept violently every day. The city dumps money into policing and harassing houseless folks. I've been arrested twice out here for stupid charges, which regarded to protesting the government out here because I am anti-fascist as well. And when I was in court, it was just filled with houseless folks. And I'm just like, they're wasting money on the wrong things. And I have protested over 100 days out here for the past year and a half since George Floyd death. And I have seen so many things that have been back to Michigan, to Kentucky, Louisville, to Tennessee, to Texas, to Portland, and back here, even through Seattle. I've seen so many houseless folks, and it's truly on us to take care of each other. Like, we are asking the wrong people for help. We need to be turning to our neighbors, our community neighbors, our comrades, and requesting that we help each other. And that is what mutual aid is. And that's why we don't take part in any organizations or any charity. And having something so accessible like this, where we start realizing that we can take care of us with growing our own food, building our own sheds or little tent homes, or even producing some type of invention for electricity, whatever we could do. But we're starting out with heaters here, and it's saving lives in this code. And I was a part of the, in Texas freeze when that happened this year. And let me tell you, that was the coldest weather I've ever felt in my life. Like, it's easy to go through the cold weather when you're in a home and you're warm and you got your fireplace. But when you don't have heat, you don't have a home, and it's freezing, it's so vital for folks like us to come out and take care of each other, because the government and the system is not going to do that. Our oppressors are not going to save us. So that's why it's so huge for us to have Heater Block Spokane here, because mutual aid isn't a big thing here. And it's a very conservative city. and the city will dump money into themselves and building a park and policing before they take care of their unhoused neighbors. And it's very sad. And so it's up to us. And that's why it's so important for us to invent and build and create and put it all together to help each other.
Yeah, and here in Spokane, it's taken the threat of negative temperatures to get the city to open up the convention center to get these people in and out of the cold. But we've been out there in the mid 20s, 20 to 25 degrees at night. We've been out there ourselves all night, and it's a 25 that feels like 15. And at that point, it's already unlivable.
It actually was 14 last week. Remember when we were at
we've had some really cold ones the last few nights, and when we were out there, it was 25, 26. But I kept checking the temperature because I'm out there and I'm walking my dog, and I'm like, this feels like 12 to 15. I kept rechecking, kept saying 25, 26, but it sure felt a lot colder than that. And when we first got there, the first night we got there with heaters, people were literally crying in their tents. And now when we show up, they're surrounding my truck, and asking for more heaters and for more fuel. And they're really relieved, and they're really, it overwhelms us how appreciative they all are. And we can't get them out fast enough. We can't make enough of them fast enough. There's a lot of people still don't have them. But they've been so gracious and so patient with us as we try to get them out. But they're doing a lot better. Just knowing that we're coming, knowing that someone cares about them, and knowing that we're going to be back the next day, and we're going to have more of these, and it's not enough, but we're going to have more the next day, and knowing that is helping keep people going too. They're doing better because they know help is on the way, and they're not getting that from their city governments at all. So.
Well, do you want to talk about any more experiences you've had in the real world doing this? I know you've already kind of given us some.
I will say one of the biggest challenges we have faced in even just trying to get these heaters out to people is, as Spokane mentioned, how bad sweeping is there. It's also horrendous here. And we will go out one day and we'll see, a tent or two in a certain area, and we'll be like, great. We'll go back later when we get off of work and we will drop heaters off here. By the time we return, those tents are gone. The cops have chucked those tents in the bin. And so it's almost like the moment we're able to provide these resources, the city removes that ability for us to even give these heaters. As effectively, they're most effective in a tent. They won't provide adequate warmth to people if they're just sitting out in the open. And that is the reality. So it's like the community wants these so badly, and the city is making it nearly impossible for the people to even have them.
Yeah, they do. They do that here too. Like it'd be here one minute and then gone the next. We also have a very huge problem with addiction here and mental illness here in the city. Disregards that so badly. And then we have these charities or organizations here who, get dump money and only put out a little bit help or ask for other help from donations or whatever. Or they have really religious guidelines to even helping folks. And it's so much going on. It's intense. And I've seen the homeless community in so many different cities, and there's so much help and with the mutual aid groups that get out there to try to help folks as much as they can. But in Spokane, is rare. It's mostly the city funded organizations here who, get these city funds and don't really actually use them to help folks, and it boils my skin and it makes me angry because I'm like, I'm only one person. I'm a single mom. I'm going through my own stuff, and, I'm trying to get back on my feet as well. And, I wish I could save everybody, and I am trying to do that with one heater at a time. And, as whatever mutual aid I can give at a time, and so I wish the city I wish they cared, but they don't, and I got over asking, and, I don't even care to ask them anymore. That doesn't, I'm like, no, we need to ask our people. We don't need to even send emails to these folks and protest to them because they're not hearing us. They're going to hear us when we create our own system, when we start building autonomous systems for ourselves and for our communities. Like, they're going to hear us when we realize that we don't need their system anymore.
You already brought this up. You mentioned the sweeps, but I'm just curious if there's anything else you want to say just on, just the continuous just attack on houseless folks, people on the street, people living in their cars. This seems to get more intense every year. I don't know if there's anything else you want to say, just kind of like what's going on.
People who are unaware, in 2020, the summer of 2020, Philadelphia, 2 homeless encampments began. One was James Talib Dean, that was known as JTD, and the other was Camp Teddy. And those lasted for about 6-ish months, I would say. And after those 2 encampments fell, the city just became one of their main focuses to never let anything like that happen again. So they take any opportunity now. If they see a houseless person who has enough is not even the right word, but to police enough resources around them, the cops will move them. It's like a game for them to see how far they can make a houseless person walk away, and scare them.
Yeah, I mean that sounds a lot like Spokane. It sounds like a lot like where we're at. The energy that they put in to sweeping homeless people completely out of existence is it's hard to process that. A couple of years ago there was they passed a no lie down order in the downtown Spokane area. You couldn't sit, you couldn't lie down after like 11 o'clock at night. And it just in the last week, there was an article in the newspaper here talking about businesses demanding that the city clean up downtown Spokane even more than they already have. Businesses are threatening to leave, if the city doesn't do something. So there's a lot of pressure on the city to eradicate human life without doing anything to support them or to provide any sort of secure housing, and they're violently and disgustingly efficient here too at just sweeping people. They push them out. They push them out further and further. And there have been times in Spokane where they've actually put people on buses and sent them out of town, to get rid of homeless people. They've gone to some pretty extreme measures historically around here to keep the city clean, but they've never put in any real meaningful effort to actually support people, to provide secure housing, to provide real support, that would give people the resources that they need, the caring community that they need in order to be able to change their circumstances. Like that doesn't exist in Spokane, and mutual aid, like people don't know what mutual aid is. I grew up in Spokane, and mutual aid is not a term that people understand here. It's literally just me and Renee right now providing mutual aid in this entire city. And that's overwhelming, because we're looking at an area of,
I wouldn't say we would be the only ones. There are folks out there, but most of the city is dominated with organizations and charities. So, but I also would like to address, not to cut you off, but the fact that even if, folks did try to get on their feet, get in housing or whatever, minimum wage here sucks because inflation is real. The housing market is a disgrace. You have to make at least about $27 to $30 an hour to be able to afford at least 2-bedroom apartment, or $25 to $27 an hour to be able to afford a 1-bedroom apartment here. So they make it really difficult with the restrictions and all these guidelines for folks to be able to get adequate housing. Even low income housing isn't really on our side. And, the Spokane Authority owns, low income apartment complex. And I've lived in one. And let me tell you, they want at least like 6 months of your bake info. of your statements. They want to verify where you worked, how long you worked there. They're going to add up every dollar to the cent of how much you make. And so it makes it really hard for people to even get into low income housing because of the restrictions and all the guidelines that they have to even get in those. And the help is just so limited here. And so it's really on us to try to get mutual aid, build out here and get folks used to that because, it's hard. Even if folks did try to get on their feet and get a job, they won't be able to do all that in a month or two. They need at least a good year or two to be able to get back on their feet. And it starts with, care, compassion, kindness, and giving without questions asked. I don't need your whole rent history of the fact that you need a home to stay into. But there's so many guidelines here that break people down and people just give up, honestly. Most of their hope is gone. And so they turn to comfort things, like people are addicted to a lot of things, so they turn to those things that, bring them comfort. And a lot of people don't understand that. So they judge them and it breaks them down even more. So it keeps them stuck even more. I spent time out there in Dallas with the houseless community out there, and it's a lot. Okay. That's a huge city. And there were so many folks who really told me that they would rather be on the street, like literally. And I had to why, question why. And then when they told me, gave me a, whole rundown on why they would rather be on the street, it's because of the city, the communities break them down, not just the city, but the people who have money or who have good jobs, they break them down and they discourage them. They make them feel less than, like they're not worthy enough of a home or, living wage to be able to provide, or, they're less than a human because they're addicted to something, it's just, it breaks you down completely. And mental health is so real. And we don't treat that really well out here in Spokane at all. There's so many folks who battle mental health all over the United States. And it just sucks because people need to be able to get that help, that care, to be able to function properly in society. And there was times where I almost lost my mind. So I'm hanging in there. I can tell you that.
Yeah, well, and the people who are trying to help, outside of those institutional organizational spaces, because there have been, I've known a few people who have tried to help through a mutual aid approach around here in Spokane, but they end up giving up, and they give up because they're exhausted and they're overwhelmed and they can't find the resource. And, the institutions and, law enforcement, they come after you for it around here too. You get attacked for it when you try to provide that kind of support. And it's just exhausting. We've experienced that too, just in the last week that we've been putting these heaters out there. We've been completely overwhelmed. My hands have been swelling up, building these things and not sleeping much, trying to get as many out as we can. And like I said, I roll up every night. And right now we're literally just going to one encampment. There's so many other places we haven't touched it. We're going to one encampment every night right now. And every night we roll up and they start shouting, the heater people are here, and they start surrounding us pretty quickly, because, wanting more heaters, and we never have enough. And so we get overwhelmed and we get exhausted. And so, while there have been and are other people that are trying to help around here, they get burnt out, and they get burnt out really fast again and again and again. And we keep coming back to it just being the city, with just being the institutions and the organizations that have the resource, and they're being granted quite a bit of money by the state around here too. And the state just granted another $1.5 million to Spokane. But, those, like Renee was talking about, the requirements and the restrictions to get that help are so overwhelming that people just can't do it without someone to support them through the process. And that's the piece that's missing. The human support, the human connection, the community is completely absent here. And I think most places where homelessness is a problem, which is everywhere in this country. It's gotten completely out of control, and it's getting worse. So,
well, let's talk about what are the group's plans for the future?
So, I gotta say, Portland is like one of the, I would say, biggest homes of mutual aid innovation right now. And so what our hope is, once we get enough heaters out, we want to be able to start raising enough donations to start building what was called rolling cabins. And they are basically like almost sweep-proof, insulated little cabins for houseless people. So honestly, like, our goal is, once we feel comfortable enough with how we're building these heaters, even though we are disabled, it is hard for us to build even just the heaters. We were able to figure out hacks. So if we could figure out hacks for heaters, I'm sure we could figure out hacks for the cabins. And our ability to learn through our difficulties is only allowing more people in the country to be able to create these heaters. And thus, once we learn how to create these cabins, it'll allow more people to create these cabins.
So awesome. That's exactly our goal as well down the line. But for right now, heaters are going to be in such high demand in the future that pretty much every winter we're going to probably be focused on building these heaters. And then, like Heater Block Philly said, that Portland is literally the home of mutual aid and, building and all that creative stuff over there. So we'll probably, take some more ideas and brainstorm on how we can keep folks cool in the summer as well. And just keep growing from there. With the rolling cabinets, who, produces the sweep proof little tent shelters we saw, which was amazing. So, putting all our ideas together, brainstorming together, and, figuring out how we could continue mutual aid, where we're not just out here for the moment, where we're out here for life, type stuff. So, and whatever life wants.
I would just like to plug the specific group's Twitter, just because for people who want to find it. It is at Rolling Cabins on Twitter, and they have these sign on how to build these. So for people who are listening and want to take the steps to do this, that's where you can find it.
Yeah, I guess I would just add that, one of our biggest challenges is just getting community support around the work that we're doing, because there is, like I said, I grew up in this town. I have a complicated relationship with it for a lot of different reasons, but there is resource in Spokane. There is money in Spokane. There is the ability to solve homelessness. We can get to that point, but we don't get there without community support. And so that's one of the things that, we're building these heaters, and even to build them, we need support, because, we only have so much resource between the two of us, even going out and working every day, and we got to keep our lights on too. So, getting out there, on social media and any way we can. Every time I just went to Target and bought 30 liters of alcohol, whenever. I always buy it in bulk, because then they want to know what I'm up to, and I get to tell them, we're building heaters for people on the street, and they want to know more, and we send them to our social media accounts, and trying to get the word out there, and trying to get people, aware of what we're trying to do, so that we can do more, for the community that we're trying to serve, which is the people that are living out there on the streets right now. So getting that support that I know is out there, but sometimes hard to find, that's one of our biggest challenges. And like I said, we've only been at it for a week too, so we got a long ways to go, but that's definitely something that we're going to be working on.
Well, thanks for everybody for joining us. Do you want to tell people how they can follow you on social media, or any other things you want to say? Or
if there's one thing I do want to say, it's I want to let all anti-fascists out there know, no matter your ability or your disability, you can contribute. There is a way we got this, and we are a community, and we will find a way. I think there is a big problem, just in general in our society, and it does exist within the anti-fascist atmosphere of ableism and of thinking that, if you suffer from a physical disability, you can't yourself actually positively contribute to change or to a movement. And that's just so wrong. You can. And also, if you hear crinkling in the background, I apologize. My kitten is being a little crazy. But no, when we started, people asked us, you think you can do this? Like you guys think you can do this? I mean, you're in pain all the time. Can you really do this? And we did. So, it's possible. You can benefit your community. Also, for social media purposes, just to also add that in, if you want to follow us on Twitter, we are at HeaterBlock PHL. And if you want to follow us on Instagram, we are HeaterBlock Philly, and block is with just a C. There is no K. And if you are able to contribute to donations, because it is just two of us, and our money only stretches so far, and we, as physically disabled individuals, have medication costs that, are draining on us as well. It is, the $ Philly Heater Block.
Awesome. And I would like to add, we thank everybody who took the time out to listen to what we have to say. It means a lot to us that you want to listen to us, to hear that, two broke folks in Spokane, in this small town, way in Washington State, that, folks are out here trying to build little heaters to keep folks warm. So that means a lot to us as well. Like said, that is all about, having that community support. And like we said, we take care of us. Like, that's like my slogan. I mean, I know all the anti-fascists and anarchists and, all that y'all say that stuff. But, I have to put some emphasis on there and say, we take care of us, because we do. Like, y'all are beautiful. I love y'all. And I'm so thankful for this community that opened my eyes to so much, because before George Floyd passed, I was oblivious to so many things, and I was caught up in the rat race, trying to, be productive and, build a future, all that blah, 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 the lies that they told us. And my world came crashing down in 2020 of May. And I guess you could say, because I have untreated ADHD, so I went in a hyper focus mode where nothing made sense, and I had to go find what made sense to me, and that led me on a journey to go protest every damn where and experience a lot of community and get to see how different movements are out here. And it was a challenge, and it was some ups and downs, and I'm still standing, I'm still here. Lost some comrades out here. We're still going, and we're still pushing. Even when we're at the bottom, we're still trying to pick people up, because we take care of us, like, it's on us to keep going. So, but if you want to follow us or check any of our handles out, the Twitter page is at Heater Block with the C, SPO, SPO. Instagram is Heater Block Spokane, and we also do have a Facebook page, Heater Block Spokane as well. And if you would like to contribute to us, our handles are in our bios. So thank you.
And I'll just add that the follows and likes and shares, just doing that, helps us. It helps us a lot. It's a big deal when people click that follow button, because that gets us out there, where the people who have the resource that want to give but don't know how to do it, they want to help but they don't know how to help, they don't know where to go. When people start clicking that follow button, liking and sharing, it makes it easier for those people out there who want to support us find us, and so that we can get that resource to the people who need it most. So the likes, follows, and shares, that's a big deal. It's as big a deal as money coming in. So yeah, we'd love to see those numbers go up for sure. And we just got started. We know they're going to go up, but it's a big deal. Like, follow, and share. It helps us a lot. So.
Same for Philly ones. That we started creating some memes to get some traction. So if you anti-fascists who like gritty memes, I hope we provide the adequate meme for you.
Also, I want to add one more thing before we go. Go follow the original Heater Bloc on Twitter. Okay, we got to give all the love to PDX. Like, I protested with y'all out there. I done been through some things with y'all out there. I love y'all to death. So, mad respect to y'all. Y'all take care of me. I'm here. I'm going to take care of y'all. We love you so much and appreciate all the mad support that's coming from y'all right now. We're still trying to reach Spokane, which is taking a little, it's very conservative out here. All the little conservative fucks out here. But we gonna keep pushing. It's all good. But just want to shout out to @Heater Bloc, PDX. We love y'all and we appreciate y'all. Thank you.
And our little sign off is going to be, thank you so much. It's going down for this opportunity. It means a lot. Thank you to everyone who listened to this. So much love to Heater Bloc Spokane. We all are inspired by you guys. So much, and to the original Heater Bloc, it has brought so much radical joy to the community that I think at one point we felt like we were missing. So just so much thanks. East to west, we got each other's back, and make some good trouble.
Underneath the bridge, the top has sprung a leak, and the animals I've trapped have all become my pets, and I'm living off of grass and the drippings from the ceiling. It's okay to eat fish, 'cause they don't have any feelings. Something in the way, something in the way, yeah, something in the way. Something in the way, yeah. Something in the way. Something in the way,
yeah. Once again, we have Marcella from Feel the News back on. You want to say anything? You have a Substack now.
Yeah, I thank you so much. Y'all are so good at helping me promote because I am terrible. Yes, I have a Substack. It's Substack.feelthenews. It's feelthenews. Oh my God, do I not even know? I don't even know my web address. This is how I know that I'm not going to make it anywhere in life. It's Substack. Feel the News on Substack. It gives you I give you a weekly summary of the news, for my feelings, like what made me angry, what made me sad, and what made me happy. Y'all should subscribe. It's really fun, and I'm a comedian, so it'll be sad, but maybe you'll smile a little.
Well, we have some interesting news. We're going to talk about this Coup PowerPoint presentation. We're going to pick that apart. Before we kind of get into that, we are going to talk about some sad news. This horrible tornado cycle that went through the Midwest, and I just think it's important to touch on what happened to this Amazon warehouse. These people were stuck there. They didn't let them leave, and there's this one instance where this guy was text messaging his partner and saying like they won't let us go, and unfortunately that facility got hit by a tornado and those people died.
Yeah, it happened in a candle factory in the next town over too. Some real similar, like people wouldn't let the workers go home, and something like 12 workers in that factory died because it got direct hit by a tornado. Yeah, and in Kentucky, I mean, keep in mind in Kentucky people are not used to tornadoes, right? It's part of why the devastation was so bad. And there's almost no public infrastructure in states like Kentucky because it's just been gutted by years and years and years of neoliberal privatization. There's no support structure. You know, so when you take poverty, former coal mining areas like Kentucky, and you add Amazon on top of that, which thrives in areas where there's a lot of out of work, low wage workers, and then you add the economic desperation of the pandemic and Appalachia and so on top of all of that, and then shove all of that into capitalism, and then add climate change on top. This is what happens.
You just keep adding
more of this.
Yeah, you keep adding more terrible layers to this terrible cake.
No, right?
Yeah, no, it's like, the whole thing is like really messed up. And I guess it's like, I'll say to whoever's listening, if you have an Amazon Prime membership, please just reconsider it. Honestly. It's like one of those things where it's like, I don't know, maybe if you're less than 12 years old, you don't remember, but there was a time where we used to have to go to the store, and sometimes they didn't have what you wanted, and you just had to wait. And then there was a time where you couldn't even order things online. This whole idea that you need to get something in 2 days is not like, I promise you'll be okay. Just drop it. Like, it's not worth it. And I know some of y'all are going to be like, there's no ethical consumption under capitalism, but we got to draw a line somewhere, right? Isn't like letting people die in a warehouse like one of the lines that we draw? Like, I mean, some dude drove, I don't know if y'all saw this on Twitter, some dude drove to Kentucky, this black guy, and he was like, I just had a car and they knew that they needed food and water.
Oh, wow.
And that's just showed up, started making food and giving people water. That's it. Like, it's like this person could drive so long to like give people food and water. You can wait a couple of days to like, I don't know. What do people order from Amazon these days? I don't know.
Yeah, and shout out, there is Mutual Aid Disaster Relief has a couple spreadsheets going around. There's a mutual aid group in Kentucky that's there. Also, I believe there's a Socialist Rifle Association group that's based out of Kentucky. They're doing a lot of stuff. So there are places to kind of like direct either aid, or if you're in the area, you can go and volunteer. So definitely encourage people to do that. It'll be interesting to see kind of like if Amazon responds to this at all, because I know after all of the union drives and stuff and the big strikes that happened, I know right after that, my YouTube got like hit with these waves of like stupid pro Amazon videos. I'm sure you all saw this if you watch YouTube. So I don't know if they're going to come back and do like, we always let our workers go home whenever they want to. Like, I don't even know how to spell tornado.
They did actually release an ad. It was like yesterday or today that I've started seeing. That is a worker. Well, someone pretending to be a worker, maybe a real Amazon worker, whatever. Someone sitting there and they're talking about how flexible of a workplace it is, and how like, when they really need to leave, they're just allowed to do that. And I'm like, yeah, that's not how that works.
Well, and again,
that's not what any other Amazon employee says their work life is like.
One of the reasons that they wanted to keep them there was that this is that golden time for Amazon between Black Friday and Christmas, where they're trying to fill all the orders, and they're trying to make just that little bit of extra money that they get by, that sweet spot in the holiday season. And for that reason, that profit margin, that's why they kept those people there. And from my understanding, that the factory itself wasn't even working. They were basically just sitting there waiting to see if things were going to turn back on so they could basically go back to work. And instead of basically sending them home in the midst of this, potential catastrophe, they said, no, we're going to keep you here because there could be possibly a situation in which things will turn back on and then we can use you.
And people will definitely not understand that their packages are late because there was a tornado. Like, right. I mean, come on. I was telling somebody about this. It's gone to a point now where like, I feel like, I know this is going to sound really crass and mean, but it's just gone to the point where we've all been so propagandized and so, what's the word, just molded to be so absorbed with like what capitalism gives us that we don't realize the actual damage we're doing to other humans like us. You know what I mean? Like we've like lost like almost a bit of our humanity because we're so obsessed with things and getting them and wanting them to the point where we're like, we don't even treat other human beings who are responsible for giving us those things as humans. Like it's just like we're these evil little robots.
Yeah, or even acknowledge that they exist. Right. I think one of the oddities of the post 1970 sort of way that we live in the United States is this sort of removal of an understanding of the reality of how things happen. That prior to that, where the U.S. was largely an industrial economy, it was really obvious how things happened, right? People went to work, they did jobs, they made things. There were people who drove trucks, but that relationship was really direct. One of the things that's happened as a result of automation, and this was getting talked about in like 1968 through like 1973 by radicals, this sort of anti-automation sort of narrative that happened at that period of time, which was really prominent with like the Black Panther Party, but also like elements of STS, almost never gets talked about anymore. But one of the things that they were saying is, you know, within capitalism as an industrial structure, there's this direct connection to work, and therefore the workplace becomes a site of political intervention because there's this direct relationship to work. When automation occurs, we start to end up in this different situation where all of a sudden there's fewer and fewer and fewer workers, and all workers get rendered relatively generic and get rendered essentially part of this kind of fluid labor pool, right? And so you're not only not attached to your workplace, you're not attached to the other people you work with or even the task you're doing, because all you're doing is sort of hitting a button or fixing a machine, something like that.
You're not making the whole thing. You're just like doing like a tiny little part, which removes you from like the whole process of like building things.
Yeah. And so that kind of radical abstraction, makes it incredibly difficult to understand everything that goes into the production and shipping and obtaining of a thing, especially when supply chains become global, and especially when those global supply chains become grounded in, you know, the use of machines or cheap labor, right? Now, I'm not saying outsourced labor because that's a really important distinction. These weren't jobs that started in the United States. These were jobs that always, for example, clothing factories, always were just built in Bangladesh, for example, right? Or built in Vietnam. They weren't moved to there from here. So this is this internationalization of the supply chain, not a displacement of where labor happens. But once that occurs, there's this material impetus to make it relatively obscure what is actually happening in the production process because it is so awful.
Yeah.
And so we just never feel it. We never touch it. We never see it. Even if we know people that might work manual labor jobs, even that visibility is just a very small sliver of the supply chain. And there's a sliver that exists in the United States, right, where things still suck, but aren't as dire as they might be in other parts of the world where industrial production occurs on a really large scale, right? That makes things like what happens in an Amazon warehouse this abstract, almost issue of of abstract politics, and not this sort of life and death question. And I think tornadoes like this, or disasters like this, sort of like mining disasters that have happened in the recent past, have this effect of reminding everybody briefly what's actually at stake in these places.
Yeah. And the other part that I know you talked about, like globally, like it's generally like in places that are like countries that are underdeveloped are now exploited. And even within this country, like we have to remember that we have like this we have a racial hierarchy where certain types of people are the ones that are doing this work at Amazon, right? Like not saying that like I don't even know if everybody who died there in the Amazon warehouse was white or not white. But generally speaking, when you see people who have these types of jobs, because we have a type of like racial hierarchy that forces a certain demographic, specifically Black people, immigrants, or other brown people to like work these terrible jobs, I think then the association of like we should actually resolve these problems like don't really bubble up as much, right? And if it's like white people, it's like poor white people. But even when you were looking at all these Amazon strikes I know specifically in New York during the pandemic, most of the people out there were Black people. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's like that aspect of it is like also very real in the sense of like, I do think that if we did not have this racial hierarchy where certain people were kind of relegated to these jobs, I don't know if they'd be safer, but maybe. Like, it's always hard to tell though, right? But capitalism works in mysterious ways. Like, it always tries to figure out a way to exploit somebody. But like, and I think that's something that we need to remember too. Like, when we're talking about Amazon, this is not just like an issue about about economics. This is also like a racial equality, like racial justice issue. Because the people who are predominantly being impacted are people who are already marginalized and exploited by the state. So, yeah. So think about it. If you drop your Amazon Prime membership, you're doing something for racial equality. If I spin it like that, is that going to make you drop it? I don't know. Maybe.
Yeah, the last thing I'll say on this is this actually brings to mind something that we talked about before in relationship to the economy, is that, you know, beyond the immense human cost and also what's happening ecologically, what's in part causing these storms, I think the other question is like, what will the impact be beyond that? Because I mean, like, huge areas have just been totally devastated. Like, I heard Biden today on NPR went there and said like, oh, the government's going to take care of everything. You know, FEMA's going to clean all this up. Don't worry. But I mean, they were also reporting that a lot of these people, like you said, I mean, this is not an area that has to deal with tornadoes. And I'm seeing today, right now, as we talk on Twitter, it looks like some places in Minnesota got hit today. And a lot of people that were hit don't have home insurance, or they're renters. And if your house gets destroyed and all your stuff's inside of it, I mean, you're not going to get, you're not going to get paid for that. So what happens to all those people and that huge impact? I mean, that's going to have a massive, massive detrimental hit to people, and that's going to have long reverberations. And obviously, I mean, they're not going to get support. You know, there's not going to be a welcome hand to help them out, get back on their feet. And this is just going to continue to be another thing like the pandemic that people are going to have to deal with. And, you know, especially people further down the racial hierarchy, or who are poor or working poor.
Yeah, it's almost just like this like mishmash of like hell for people who are already exploited. I mean, their lives are already hard and difficult, and then you add these layers. And meanwhile, Time Magazine gives Elon Musk, who got $4.9 billion in subsidies, Person of the Year. It's like, no, he's not. He's just like a government project. Like, that's where all our money goes, all our tax dollars, instead of helping people. And like, I don't know. It's like, it's rough sometimes to think about it.
Well, and it's going to be, I think, this interesting question, especially when we're talking about Kentucky, which, again, is one of the more heavily impoverished parts of the United States. Like those, I mean, anyone that's ever been to like Southeast Ohio or Southwest Pennsylvania or like Northern West Virginia or something like that. I mean, these areas are significantly more impoverished than the cities that they're near, and those cities are some of the poorest cities in the country. So like, it is really staggering, just how impoverished some of these areas of the U.S. are. And there's this big question that always arises, and this was part of the question that arose in New Orleans after Katrina. What is recovery, right? Which is, because we also have to ask the question of like, what do we mean when we say the word disaster, right? And so on some level, there's this assumption, and we saw this language after the financial crisis, right? Like, when the market crashed, people were talking about the end of the world, right? Not the end of capitalism, not a, recession in the procession of market economics, but the end of the world, right? In a sort of definitive sense. And on some level, that's a really fascinating sort of conjunction point, right? Where we're assuming that the sort of functionality of capitalism and the world are sort of concurrent terms. When you get into a place like the Lower Ninth Ward in New Orleans, or you get into a place like Kentucky, that's not necessarily true. And business interests are not the primary interest in those areas, like human people interests are, right? And those people in specifically the Lower Ninth of New Orleans, or in a lot of parts of a place like Kentucky, are barely hanging on to begin with. And so this question now has to arise, what happens with, quote, recovery, right? How does recovery happen? And this is one of the really important parts of the mutual aid disaster response project, specifically mutual aid disaster relief and a bunch of other ones. Because what they've done is they fundamentally realigned what recovery looks like. That it's not about economic recovery, quote unquote. That doesn't mean anything. It's actually about the recovery of actual communities, like real things that actually really exist, that actually can support actual people, right? And not these sort of mythologies of bringing business back and rebuilding infrastructure and all these other kinds of things. A place like Kentucky is going to be a really fascinating place to watch that conversation play out, because currently the governor is a Democrat, and one that was a relatively progressive Democrat, but is still a Democrat and therefore a capitalist in a part of the country which is, I mean, remember, the senators from the state of Kentucky are Rand Paul and Mitch McConnell. Right, which just tells you pretty much everything you need to know about politics in the state of Kentucky, right? So if they get their way, of course, Amazon will get their warehouse back. But the neighborhood that might have been right next to their warehouse is not going to get the same level of support. We really need to be paying attention to those kinds of dynamics, because we talk a lot about disasters on this show, because they're really frequent and increasingly so. And more resources and more of politics is starting to center around notions of sort of preservation and recovery, right? Which is always the narrative that is taken on when you start to watch, powerful states start to implode, right? That there's this idea that there is this vision of the world that we have to continue to uphold, but it's falling apart. And so everything becomes about security and preservation and recovery and so on, so on, so on. The return to normality. Anyone that's been listening to the show probably hear something really familiar in that, because that is exactly how we describe the entirety of the Biden administration too. Mm-hmm. It's an act of preservationism. It's this attempt to save an American project which collapsed 15 years ago.
But the other part about it, though, too, though, is like when we're talking about save and preserve and secure, who, like for whom, right? For it's whom, not for the people at the bottom of this, like, right, of this ladder. It's for people at the top, for them to continue to secure their economic interests, for them to be able to keep on having their yachts, for them to, like, maintain this lifestyle without us pretty much turning on them, right? Yeah. And that's what it's about. But then the reality of it is that, like, no one's gonna save us but us. Nothing that anybody has ever gotten has been given by a government or corporations. All they do is take. They're never gonna give. And they take and they give it to their rich friends, or like the people who actually run things. So when you talk about security and, securing things, it's not for people. It's not you and me they're talking about. They're talking about, Bezos, or I don't know.
Yeah. Elon Musk.
Elon Musk, evil Musk, whatever you want to call him.
Who described himself as a utopian anarchist recently in the press.
Yeah!
Which is so weird.
So frustrating. But yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, I think if we had to write kind of like, report back on 2021, at least in terms of kind of like bourgeois politics, I feel like that was totally what they wanted to do, is they wanted to return everything to normal with Biden coming into office. And also just the craziness of January 6th, which we're going to talk about in a second. But essentially just all of the entrenched inequalities that supposedly Biden went into the administrative office supposedly going to like push back against. I mean, none of those even piecemeal reforms. I mean, like everything from like canceling student debt to raising wages. I mean, none of that happened. And in fact, the only instances that it's did is because people went on strike, or they were basically removing themselves from the economy, and basically in a de facto strike, causing certain businesses to force themselves to offer higher wages. So, yeah, nothing really changed. I mean, there was the only normal that I think things went back to is that just inequality in itself was only either further entrenched, the system doubled down on funding the police. The Pentagon budget was just as high as ever. I mean, everything essentially was business as usual, if not more so. And things continue to get worse. And we continue to see the fallout of that, case in point, what we're talking about in Kentucky. But just to kind of continue forward, the next thing we're going to talk about is this situation with this Coup PowerPoint, which has this zany title, and basically it's around 40 pages, I think, one of you was saying. And
like 30, there's like a 38-page version and a 36-page version.
Yeah.
I haven't read through any of them, but you know.
And it's basically like a PowerPoint version of the memo that was kind of floating around out there, maybe about a month ago. But basically, it just kind of goes step by step on how they can basically go about calling a coup, and it involves everything from calling into question the votes of Democrats and basically installing Trump, and also calling on people at the Capitol to act. And let's just kind of like start to unpack this. There's a lot to be said. Liz Cheney leaked all these text messages from everybody from Donald Trump's kids to Fox News hosts, basically just totally exasperated and like totally out of their mind, saying how upset they were and that Trump needed to basically stop the January 6th attempted coup. And yeah, there's a lot to unpack here, and we're going to get to all of it. But what are people's initial thoughts on this thing?
I honestly, if I wasn't so terrified, I'd be entertained. I mean, these people are, first of all, I will say this. I think they should have just named this whole thing How to Do a Coup Badly. But also, these people just like were so reckless, and like their confidence level was so high. And to have this whole idea that he's going to call what is he going to call, a state of emergency, and then he's going to figure out a way to stay president. It doesn't even seem like they were really clear. It seems like it was a lot of fluid thoughts, but they thought it was going to work. But the thing that's like most scary for me in this particular case is that these white people got together and they thought, oh, whiteness is going to protect us from the system. Let's just do this thing real quick. You know what I mean? Like, that is the most terrifying thing for me, specifically just like knowing like the levels of people that like Meadows, who's like was involved in this. And then I read that some Republican senators saw this PowerPoint on on January, was it like January 5th? And like nobody raised their hand and was like, oops, no, maybe we shouldn't do this. You know, just like the fact that like white people are so obsessed with protecting white supremacy that this whole idea of like democracy, which honestly doesn't exist, they're willing to go to these lengths to protect it, and also think that people are going to side with them because they actually think they're right. Like, those are my first thoughts.
Yeah. I think there's a lot going on here. So I wanna call back to the last episode, right? Because on the last episode, one of the things we were talking a lot about was this sort of Bannonist attempt to seize control of boards of elections and state attorney general's offices and county commissioner offices and things like that, very intentionally, to be able to, quote, make sure that the right people voted, right? They're setting up to commit mass election fraud, right? In the open. They also did the same thing in the lead up to the election, in which they installed all of these like Trumpian national conservative operatives in the Department of Justice and Homeland Security and the DOJ and so on. And these people, for a while, it's become really difficult to see what they were working on, like what they were doing behind the scenes and how that was starting to interact with other things that were happening. Now, as this information is coming out, we're starting to see it. And one of the things that's becoming really, really clear is that after the election happened, any of the people that were in Trump's orbit that had a political future, right? Let's just put it that way, a political future, walked away, most of them. They didn't want anything to do with this. Now, they didn't come out publicly and say anything about it, but they slowly but surely drifted into the background. Some like Stephanie Grisham, who, you know, is terrible in a lot of ways, but kind of sidelined herself for a couple of weeks. And then when January 6th happened, just quit, like immediately, right? Elaine Chao, who was Secretary of Transportation, was also Mitch McConnell's significant other, did the same thing. Right? Even Betsy DeVos did the same thing, like quit on January 6th after a few weeks of drifting into the background. And what happened in that vacuum, and you see
Literally
this,
the Homer meme come to life.
Oh yeah, for real, like just drifting into the background quietly. Yeah,
like into like
absolutely.
the what is the shrub? Just
Yeah.
I had nothing to do with this. Should have just worn camo at that point and just be like, no one can see me.
And so as these like quote more legitimate people kind of get out of the way, Trump just kind of attaches himself to any wingnut that has enough prominence to get in front of him. And so this is where some of these people like Sidney Powell show up. And this is where Lynn Wood shows up. And all of that whole sort of process was being orchestrated by Giuliani. This is where Giuliani shows up, right? Because Giuliani wasn't even really working on the campaign until the day after the election, right? That's where he shows up. And in this case, the guy is a guy named Phil Waldron, Phil Waldron is a former Army colonel. What happens in those worlds, though, is really fascinating. And the callback to the last episode is this. In these worlds, specifically the further and further you drift into conspiracy theory world, the further and further the discourse leaves a complicated understanding of reality. And so in their minds, they're sitting there planning what they see as a way to stay in power, right? That they're going to just call into question these votes. They're then going to get Mike Pence to, reject the slate of electors, to take it back to the states. Then they're going to have the states not come up to an answer. So then, the House of Representatives, which was controlled by Republicans at the time, can sort of make a decision, so on, so on, so on. They had this whole trajectory. In that whole trajectory, there was never a discussion of what happens if the lawsuits fail. There's never a discussion of what happens when it becomes obvious that we're just talking a bunch of bullshit. They never asked the question of what happens if we're successful? What is the response going to be? Because the response is not going to be everyone's going to just stay home, right? That was never going to be what was going to result from that. And so on some level, there's this process that existed, which became almost monastic in a way, right? And the more and more that I read about the late days of the Trump administration, this becomes really clear. They cloistered themselves, right? They sort of, circled around each other and just refused to really engage with anything outside of themselves. And when they did do that, the only people that they were talking to were people that were further down that pathway than even people like Mark Meadows were. Then you have another group of people like Laura Ingraham, Sean Hannity, people like this, who were texting Trump during the attack on the Capitol, talking about how this was going to destroy his legacy, only to go on the news that night on their shows less than 3 or 4 hours later to claim that it was an Antifa false flag attack or a, nice tourist stroll through the Capitol, and that nothing serious happened at all. That transparency is really the takeaway from here. We're starting to see all of the little things that happen in the background that looked like they were going on, but that we couldn't really identify the shape of as things were proceeding. All of that's coming into focus now.
Well, let's kind of hit on that point for a second. So, we have Fox News hosts like Laura Ingraham saying he's destroying his legacy. Donald Trump Jr. is texting saying literally he's got to knock this shit off.
Texting Meadows, not even his own dad.
Right.
There's like a goal between him and his dad.
Right. And he's saying over and over again that his dad needs to basically make a statement and get everybody to go home. And we know also that while this is happening, Meadows is basically saying he agrees, but also Trump is just watching TV. And my favorite part about all this is that Trump loves it, but he keeps complaining. He says how low class all the people, his supporters, look like. So, which I find funny because it's like he loves them, but at the same time he's like, I wouldn't want them, around my hotel.
Like he would never be friends, exactly, or like be his friend.
Right,
like he's like they're fans. They're fans. They're like dirty fans that he wants to stay away from him.
Right. They can buy the steaks, that's fine, but they can't come over.
Don't
for
dirty.
dinner.
Exactly. Don't eat my steaks with me. Just keep them outside. Eat them in the yard.
Eat them in the yard. Well, my question to you all is that when they say like this is destroying Trump's legacy, that sounds, there's something there. So, I mean, what exactly were they destroying? And like, basically, why were all these people panicked? Obviously, like, it didn't go the way they wanted. Trump was not installed, but like, were they worried that his like image was going to be hurt, that he would lose supporters, that they were all going to get in trouble? Is it all the above? I'm curious, like, what were they so afraid of?
I personally think that is that when they say Trump's legacy, you have to remember that like Fox News and like honestly all the media made so much money from Trump, like a ton of money from Trump. And I think when they talk about Trump's legacy, specifically when it comes from the Fox News perspective, he made all this money by ginning up all this white hatred that was always looming underneath, but was able to finally be released. And you could openly say things that you were never able to say before. Well, there was a time where you could say those things, but around like 5 years ago, they were like, maybe you can't say that. And like all this like white resentment that built up. And I think somebody mentioned, and the peak of it was like Obama. Trump was able to like blow that lid open and allow people like to be more like to have Fox News for Tucker Carlson to be a little more, like a little bit more racist than he was before, And so by doing that, by allowing them to have like this sort of like freedom of speech and to say the things that they've never been able to do before, Trump gave them that. Now, if Trump went to prison, does that go away? I think it's like part of that, and also just creating like this whole, I think like maybe even like a bubble of white people to feel like, oh, we can finally fight back against this like, insurgents against white supremacy. Like Trump gave that a platform. And I think that's his legacy. And I think if he goes to prison and all these bad things happen, then it's like, then we have to question like, if this person is in prison, then all these things that he allowed to do, are these things okay to do?
I would argue this whole discussion of Trump, quote, destroying his legacy really is three completely different discussions depending on what part of the right wing you're talking about. Mm-hmm. And the implications are really different. So you have your Trumpian true believers, right? I mean, you definitely have your Marjorie Taylor Greenes, Mark Meadows, people like this who, I mean, legitimately are willing to go down with the ship, like Mark Meadows is about to get charged with contempt of Congress. Like these are people willing to take a fall because they legit, for whatever reason, right? However much we want to chalk this up to delusion, believed in what was happening. There was a large group of Trump supporters that really believed, a lot of this has to do with the fact that they've kind of created these propaganda-centric media bubbles, but really did believe that Donald Trump was making everything amazing and that America was better than it's ever been, except for those damn rioters and the communists in Antifa who are trying to destroy it. Like, they really believed this. Like, there is a 20 to 30% of the American population believes.
I mean, to some extent, didn't he though for them? Like, because it's like for them, I think it's never been like, if you think about it, like white supremacy only serves as like a few white elites, and then the other white people are tricked to thinking that they're gaining from it, right? Yes. So, don't you think like Trump kind of in a way did that because he made it okay for them to like finally come out and say these things that they've never been able to say before, which is most of the privilege that they've always had, which some of it was being removed, right? I don't know.
Oh yeah, well, and that's part of the vision, right? Like that's part of the perfect world that Trump was creating for them is, well, now they can say whatever they want on the internet without consequences. And if they have consequences, that's just people canceling them. It's not that they're being a jerk that no one wants to talk to. Or as John Oliver said, if you walk into someone's living room and you pee on the carpet, that doesn't make you an epic troll. It just makes you an asshole. Right?
It really does. But that's
really,
not
really
how
does.
they view it. It's just owning the libs.
Yeah, exactly. And so like that whole world, the destruction of Trump's legacy was for the operatives in that world, for Mark Meadows, for people like Katrina Pearson, people like this. That destruction of legacy really meant something to them. Right? That this was the destruction of all of these great things that they think that they achieved. Because he signed some pieces of paper and then claimed that a bunch of stuff was done. When in reality, they did almost nothing as an administration that didn't just involve an executive order. Right? Like nothing that has any real persistence. So that's one group. You have another group of people, which are your Mitch McConnell, Mitt Romney, Liz Cheney types. For them, what they saw on January 6th, and this is why a lot of them have kind of shifted into a more critical stance about that, as sort of an analog to being critical about Trump. They're seeing the writing on the wall here, which is that conservatives are already a political minority. they've been able to maintain power through manipulating the machinations of the American state, but that doesn't last for much longer. And they need random suburban white folks to vote for them, even if those random suburban white folks are only doing that about tax policy, which is actually a good amount of Trump voters in 2016 that voted for him did so for reasons of, tax policy or something like that, and switched their votes in 2020. And that shift is almost statistically the same margin that he lost by, right? Like that's a really important shift, even with all of the increases in voter turnout and all of that. It was that shift.
So funny is that I draw the line to my taxes going up. The racism, fine. That's fine. That's okay. That's okay. We're gonna do that. But the taxes, no. This is sorry, please continue.
Well, it really came down to this, my friends thinking I'm racist is definitely worse than paying taxes. Small amounts of tax. Seriously, that is what a lot of the calculation was. And so people shifted sides, right? And so for people like McConnell, something like January 6th is the ugliness that always lives under the surface of right-wing politics that makes people in sort of exurbs outside of cities run away really, really, really fast. Because now all of a sudden you have all these people with Nazi shirts and Confederate flags storming a building. That doesn't make the right wing look very good. And it sort of challenges that whole image of, adult, responsible, wholesome American values, right? All of that kind of falls away when the people beating up police are doing it with Blue Lives Matter flags, right?
The irony of all that. But it's their racist uncle from Thanksgiving is out there speaking.
Oh, yeah. Well, I think I've said before, January 6th is what happens when everyone's racist uncle ends up in the same place.
White people's racist uncles, right?
Yeah.
I did see two black people and I was like, oh, maybe they got lost. I don't know.
And then there's this third group, which are the Bannonites, right? The national conservative types.
Oh my God, please never use that word ever again. Bannonites. Oh,
Bannonites. They exist in this space in which they really are doing or view themselves as doing this sort of hidden secret elite thing where they're trying to convince enough people to go along with what they're trying to do to position themselves to be able to seize power more or less into perpetuity. This endangers all of that. For them to succeed, they have to have Trump as a figure, as someone who is this public figure that for, 45% of the population doesn't seem dangerous. And that's enough to, if they attach themselves to him, ride his coattails back into power. It's exactly what the neoconservatives did. It's a strategy that's really, really, really common amongst fringe factions of the electoral right wing. The problem is that those fringe factions fail when people see what they are transparently, almost universally. This happened with the John Birch Society. This happened with the Goldwater campaign. This happened with Nixon. This happened with Reagan. So on, so on, so on. When the curtain falls away and people can see that really behind Steve Bannon are a bunch of Aryan Nations people, right? People that are in militia groups, people that are, horrendously Islamophobic, so on, and unapologetically so. It sort of makes the whole national conservative vision a little bit less appealing to almost anybody else. And so the Trump legacy is most important not because of Donald Trump, but it's most important because of what other people attach to the figure of Donald Trump. Because the person Donald Trump doesn't understand anything about politics, accomplished essentially nothing except really racist executive orders, and then trying to, launch a coup on his own government to stay in power, and saying a lot of really awful stuff that threw people into, high levels of anxiety for 4 years and made them feel like their lives were under threat. Right.
But the scary thing is that it worked, right? So when you're talking about the thing about is talking about how these Bannon they don't want the sort of the veil to be lifted about their bullshit. Trump kind of did that though, right? He did say a lot of he came out how did he start off his campaign going down the elevator talking about how Mexico wasn't sending their best people here, which is so ironic because this white settlers actually went to Mexico and it's called Texas now.
Right.
Isn't that funny? They let you in and you took over. So it's like, who are you talking about? You did that.
I was going to say, I think that with Trump, there's something interesting happening there, though, which is slightly different in that, we were talking about the Know Your Enemy podcast before we started recording, and which everyone should listen to if you want to understand the trajectory of modern right-wing thought. It's brilliant. But one of the things that they talk about a lot is how certain assumptions of acceptability structure a lot of what a politician can get away with, or what a commentator can get away with. And so, you look back to, say, William F. Buckley running for the mayor of New York in, I think, the 70s, right? Most of what he said was really overtly racist. But he was also a really image-conscious person who was trying to appeal to moderates, which means that he felt that that was acceptable to say. Not that it was pushing a boundary, but that it was actually firmly in the middle of what was acceptable. And in a lot of ways, what Trumpism showed a lot of us, specifically us like urban dwelling radicals, most of us, is what other people in the US consider to be normal. Because when he's coming down the escalator saying racist stuff, what he's articulating is something that's actually said quietly in hushed tones by 40% of the population.
And
or said in rooms where white folks are the only people there, right? Like
and
those
that's exactly what I wanted to head on. Like, I don't think Trump's legacy would have been destroyed by him being an open racist, because he was, and a lot of these people are, right? Like, I grew up in Temple, Texas, and like, when I tell you I heard and seen some things, I'm be right straight up. I knew that those people existed because I grew up with them. And so when Trump won, I almost wasn't even surprised, because like, these people for the longest time have been told they have to shut up and put up with a PC, everybody's equal, blah, 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 like bullshit. And all of a sudden they're like, we can say it now, and this is our dude. And it scares me, because I think that is America's legacy. And I don't think that that's like I hate to say this, I don't think that's a bad thing for a lot of white people.
Yeah, go ahead, sorry.
No, I was just gonna say, even like white liberals that I hang out with will just casually say, oh, my family member's part of QAnon. Like, I know nobody from QAnon. Do you know what I mean? Like, like, white people are just like so used to like this, like people just like being like this, I don't know, like, I guess racist, and like it just being in passing and it being their family members, that I don't think they actually view it as a threat anymore.
Yeah, I mean, the part that the National Conservatives are trying to hide isn't the racism part, right? Yeah. Like, that's the part they're actually really overt about. The part that they're trying to hide is the authoritarianism part. Right?
Oh, I see what you're saying.
The part where they seize control of the state and use the power of the state to, as they say, reward their friends and crush their enemies. This is like a slogan in National Conservative world. That's the part. So what's happening in that world is really fascinating, and this is why the Trump legacy is so important for them. Trump was able to make a run at authoritarianism, and did, in a lot of ways, approximate elements of that. Was never able to really coalesce that into a sort of totalitarian sort of state structure. All state structures are authoritarian, but wasn't able to really coalesce that into something that was autocratic, right? Even though there were clear moves being made in that direction. What he was able to do, though, was he was able to make clear moves in that direction while maintaining the idea that he was doing that in the name of America and in the name of freedom, right? It's the irony. It's the paradox of Trumpism that allows it to work, right? In that you can say, I am fighting for freedom by forcing everybody to pray my prayers in school, because that's what freedom is. And he was able to sort of take this misappropriation of the idea of autonomy that forms the core of so much of the American political ethos, this idea that you can have both state and autonomy at the same time, right? Attach this idea of the state to a national project, and then claim that that was the affirmation of everything that everyone always loved to begin with, specifically white folks and his supporters, right? He was able to do that without ever talking about autocracy. He was able to start to implement those things without ever having to be overt about it. What the National Conservatives fear most, and this is not me projecting, this is their own literature, is that by people seeing the elements of that movement clearly, by seeing the fact that Patriot Front people go to those conferences. American Identity Movement people have pretty much just folded themselves into the National Conservative fold. Breitbart people are constantly trading white nationalist literature with each other. Once you see all of that, National Conservatism can be seen for what it is, which is an overtly fascist political movement. But that fails in America. Because even though America's deeply fascist, 60% of the country doesn't see it that way. They view it as very much the opposite of that. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's really true. This narrative of like using the state to crush your enemies has sort of taken on currency with the Trumpian wing of the Republican Party, which, though they're really loud, statistically are about 40% of Republicans. That's it. And it's also taken hold in, kind of a weird neoliberal sort of space as well, right? Within the Democratic Party around things like counterterrorism laws, right? Those kinds of things. But underlying all of those narratives even is still this idea that we have to do this to save freedom, right? That when all of a sudden it gets shown that there is no end to that tunnel, that you just live in autocracy forever, that's really where, again, statistically, you start to see people move away from those kinds of ideas. Even though underlying all of American politics are exactly the same ideas, there's this delusion that that's not true.
Yeah, even in practicality, though, it's not just politics. Like, using the state to crush your enemies, like, what do the cops do, right? Like, they over-police people who people don't view as important, and then they throw them in prison. Like, this is already happening. Like, that's really fascinating to me. One question that I do want to ask is, like, when Trump was saying that maybe I should get, 12 years, and, like, his supporters were all for it, what was that all about? I guess for me, I've always thought that, like, white people are perfectly okay with, like, autocracy as long as that's used to maintain white supremacy.
Yeah, well, so
to me, like, that's what it seems like, because America does seem like sort of like autocratic to me in a way.
So the analogy he used was Roosevelt, right? Because like Roosevelt, before the passing of, I'm forgetting the number of the amendment that actually set formal presidential term limits, but that happened in the 1950s, right? So prior, like Roosevelt was able to serve 3 and going into a 4th term, right? And so Trump is saying, well, the Mueller investigation was an extraordinary circumstance like World War II. And so because I had my first term stolen, then I can take another one. Now, what's really important about that idea, though, I think, is that there is still an endpoint being posited there. It's just 12 years from now, not 8, right? There's still this idea that there's a time without Trump, even at the end of that. Now, a lot of his supporters had sort of shifted that view by the time we get to January 6th, right? And there was absolutely this undercurrent, specifically amongst like QAnon and sort of adjacent circles, of the idea of the MAGA utopia run by Trump and Michael Flynn forever, right?
Yeah.
But again, that's a sliver of the American population. The majority of Trump supporters still hold on to this narrative of America as an expression of freedom. And it's not just rhetorical. They really mean it.
That is so hilarious to me, because, like, don't we live in, sometimes, like, do we live in the same country? I don't understand how you could, like, live in the same place with me and come to, like, a completely different conclusion. That's fascinating. I ask
this question all the time.
You're listening to It's Going Down, part of the Channel Zero Anarchist Podcast Network. Follow us online at itsgoingdown.org and on Twitter at IGD_news. If you like and appreciate this podcast, go to itsgoingdown.org/shop and give us a one-time donation. Sign up to donate monthly or donate through Bitcoin. Again, that's itsgoingdown.org/shop to support. And now, back to the show. What's going to be interesting, this week, the Wall Street Journal put out a poll showing that Hispanic voters that they polled were split evenly between Democrats and Republicans. And this is something we've talked about on the show before, but as we continue, I can totally see the kind of the non-fascist, quote unquote, more neoliberal, more like neocon wing of the party embracing at least sections of that and continuing forward, whereas kind of the Tucker Carlson, populist, quasi-fascist Groyper wing will, scream about the Great Replacement.
Yeah, well, and this was, so I don't know if y'all remember back to the Trump administration, or the Bush administration, right? But the whole idea of compassionate conservatism, quote unquote, part of that was exactly this gambit, right? Like Bush would give speeches in Spanish, and he would constantly talk about immigration reform. And all of that was a very intentional, and there's strategy documents pointing this out, but all of that was a very intentional attempt to sort of get ahead of that shift that you're talking about right now. Now, what's really interesting is you're seeing that shift in politics in that community also rise concurrently with the rise of conspiracy theories in that community. And there's all these studies that were done specifically in Florida and California on Spanish-speaking radio and television stations. There was an extreme amount of right-wing advertising that happened on those mediums, and tons and tons and tons of robocalls, Spanish language literature getting mailed to people's houses, all of which were trying to convince everybody that Joe Biden was a secret communist who is coming to destroy everyone and eat their children. And there's actually a ridiculously large uptake of things like QAnon in that community as a result. What's fascinating about that, though, is that those kinds of political shifts tend to be relatively temporary. I think the big question is going to be, as you're saying, will the moderate wing of the Republican Party, whatever that is at this point, will they be able to sort of seize that space, control it, and use that as a way to regain control of the Republican Party? I don't know. I mean, I think there's a lot of races going on. Yeah, maybe not. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't think they want to. I don't think they want to because I think that, like, and even you see with, like, the liberals, I think that, I'm gonna be straight up, I think white people are terrified, and I think the politicians know. White people are terrified because they think that this whole world that was built for them is coming down crushing, and that's why they're fighting so hard. And I think that these white politicians, like, when they see that, like, they're sympathetic.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that they're going to stop trying to appease them or appeal to them. Because at the end of the day, what we forget is that this country is, like, still extremely racist, right? And even Joe Biden, who, you know, like, will say things and will, like, say this quiet parts out loud sometimes, and you remember that. I don't want to be hopeless and I don't want to sound nihilistic, but I'll be very real. I don't think that the political climate is going to shift to the left anytime soon. I think that because of the fear, and I think that because the income inequality is getting worse, fascism seems like just an okay option to keep capitalism going.
Well, that seems to increasingly be what's happening, right? I mean, we've been watching that trajectory for years.
I definitely think we're seeing that on the Republicans. I think within the Democrats, I think you're even more right in the sense that, like, they are trying to basically circumvent or push back against or smother this, like, explosion of black liberation, anti-pipeline, you know, rank and file, gig worker, you know, fast food workers walking out, you know, all that stuff. They're trying to basically just shove it aside and pretend it doesn't exist and kind of go back to their bread and butter of, you know, coastal kind of, you know, neoliberals in big cities and stuff like that. And, you know, but the problem is that segment is growing, and that is becoming, like, the dominant kind of, like, group in America that also doesn't really have a party per se, which I think is for an anarchist. I mean, that's what's fascinating about today is that more and more young people are getting more and more radicalized, and also seeing in a lot of ways, you know, kind of not only just the realities of what we're up against in terms of climate change, but also just, like, the limits of the wages of whiteness and just kind of the realities of just this racially organized system. And just a lot of people, including a lot of white people, also just saying, like, fuck it, we don't want this, it sucks, and let's just get rid of it. So, and just both parties being totally freaked out about that and not having any idea what to do about it except throw tons of police and the National Guard at it and throw
we're gonna crush you with our boots.
Yeah. Well, and to shift further and further and further into these kind of cloistered bubbles, right? Like, I think that this is, you know, we talked earlier about how within the Trump administration, this kind of groupthink took control, and it allowed for certain kinds of things to happen. But the same thing happens in Democratic circles as well. Like, I live in a really heavily Democratic city. I live in a Democratic city that very recently has experienced a pretty drastically ascendant left wing on a lot of different planes within local politics. And a lot of that had to do with the uprising, the things that preceded that. What happened here, though, and what happened in a number of other places that's really interesting is that the mainstream of the Democratic Party in this area tried really hard. They raised money from Trump supporters. They raised money from Republicans and industry groups and literally anyone to boost the moderate candidate in the mayoral race who got 30% of the vote and got trounced, right? They spent a bunch of money trying to destroy police reform budget initiatives, all of which won, right? And the mainstream of the Democratic Party lost hard. And and that's happening in New York City. That's happening in a number of places.
No.
Right,
We have Eric Adams now.
Yes.
Yeah. And the Buffalo write-in, like, they literally wrote in the incumbent who lost the primary. So I want to move where you are, because I don't know what's happening here. I'm like a little scared. And he's like, I think he was talking about how broken Windows policy was okay.
Yeah,
maybe we might bring it back. It seems kind of nice. It was an ex-cop though, so we don't.
He's taking out the politics of Giuliani. But like, what's happening in all these places, I think that's fascinating to me, is that where the people who end up voting Democrat, where their politics are, and where the Democratic Party's politics are increasingly at odds. And not just increasingly distant, but say the politics of the uprising and the politics of the Democratic Party are not just distant from each other, they are conflictual with one another.
I think it's going to be really hard for a Biden-type Democrat to stand in front of a bunch of millennials and Zoomers and be like, hey, I'm going to get rid of your student debt. I'm going to do all these like bread and butter things we've been talking about for 30 fucking years, and say that with a straight face, because they've been saying it for so long. And it's like, here they have the presidency, they have control over both houses of Congress, and they can't get shit done. And not only that, but they have these people locking elbows with Proud Boys and militia members running around, and they're just like dumbfounded as to what to do. And they have not done anything for anybody. I mean, like, I remember the kind of like, before the election, and there was this, what you hear the same time from the left over and over again, that, we're going to push Biden to the left. We're going to, push this progressive agenda. We're going to hold his feet to the fire, and that, it's going to be the movements that push them to make these, and like, none of that happened. And they did exactly what we said they were going to do, is they basically recuperated the language from the movements. They put BLM in the background. When they did that one thing where they did the DNC, but they did it online, but lo and behold, they doubled down on funding the police. They did all that stuff, and
they gave more money to the military than Trump did.
Exactly.
Well, and this creates a big tension for them, right? And it's kind of a similar tension to what's happening a bit in the formal Republican Party. But for that middle to hold, and for that middle to coalesce, they have to marginalize the very people that they rely on. Right? Like, we were talking about this in the last episode, there's all of this like, oh my God, Biden's popularity is going down, which means that Trump will win in 2024. All that assumes that people voted for Joe Biden.
Yep.
And not against Donald Trump. Like, all of that assumes that Joe Biden had popularity, when in reality, that was never true. Right? He never was popular amongst the vast majority of the people that voted for him. And people were voting against, the rise of overt fascism in the streets. It was like a pretty clear, cut and dry Trump / literally anybody else, right?
Yeah. Keep that stuff in the living room at home. We do not need it out in the streets.
Yeah, and so for a couple months, there could be a sort of détente there. But you can only marginalize whole generations of people for so long before there's backlash. And part of, the argument I've been making about the uprising, the cause of the uprising, is that the actual fundamental political conditions that allowed for the uprising to happen, outside of the pandemic, outside of the murder of George Floyd, the underlying sort of dynamic of that was in the cities that saw the most intense rioting. A lot of those cities were cities that very recently had, quote, dramatic police reform. That what happened in all of those places is the local Democratic Party in a lot of those places went, cool, you want police reforms? Great. We'll put you on a committee. We'll have these conversations. There will be some legislation. And then nothing changes. And the next time people go out in the streets, the politicians engage in the same sort of rhetoric again. People go home, nothing changes. They go out again, same thing happens. And eventually that breaks. Like eventually the failure of reformism to actually solve problems breaks out into the streets. And so while the Democratic Party views itself as risking that currently, like marginalizing the quote left from themselves, that's way already happened. Right? And this is what makes the current political situation in the U.S. So volatile right now. It is
very volatile.
Yeah, those moderating forces of the major parties aren't functioning at all in that way. And what's happening is that the right wing is running as far away to the right as fast as it possibly can with as many guns as possible. And that's a really dangerous scenario for the rest of us, right? All of that is about the failure of the middle, though. All of it, fundamentally.
Well, I also do think it's like part of it is because these parties are essentially in place to serve the wealthy and the elites. And so at the end of the day, I always feel like this is like some sort of like smokescreen, like this theater that they do for us is to just to keep people thinking that, oh, things are going to change, things are going to get better, so that people don't actually like do anything about it, right? Like the Republican Party and the Democrats, as a lot of people say, they're like the same party, right? They're just playing with us. Because at the end of the day, they both serve one group of people, and we all know who that is. And I think that now there's a realization of that, what's happening. I do think that that's why the Republican Party is running further to the right. Because what do you do when capitalism fails? Or when people realize that capitalism isn't working for them and they're actually fighting against it? What happens if those people actually form like a racial allyship beyond and moves beyond like white supremacy to try to like end this? Like, we know what happens when that happens. That's when the state puts its foot down and becomes more fascist. And I think it's no surprising that the right is running further to the right, because they're like kind of like anticipating that people are pissed. But then at the end of the day, there are also white people who like are okay with kind of not being that great as long as they just are white. They don't want whiteness to be destroyed. And I think there's enough allies in that end to somewhat like almost try to like make a run for fascism in this country. And I'm not saying that it's gonna succeed. I'm just saying that it's like the two parties are not able to work with the middle because the two parties have never been meant to serve the middle. Like the Democrats were never here to help. They were just here to act like, oh, this is another option, you guys. Like, don't worry, everything's gonna be fine. We're here. But people are realizing that's not the case.
That's always been kind of the fundamental difference, is that the bourgeois right is willing to weaponize these fascist forces, whereas the neoliberals are terrified of poor and working people getting off the chain. Like that's their worst case scenario. In fact, they're more than willing to accommodate kind of the growth of this kind of like neo-fascist bloc within the Republican Party than they are of going to the left and letting the chain a little loose off people's necks. But let's switch now to just another aspect of it. I want to get people's reaction to the text messages between specifically like Fox News and people that are around Trump. I mean, like, as we were saying before we were recording this, like none of this is shocking to us, but I mean, it is interesting to see kind of like the sausage being made, so to speak.
Yeah, before we started recording, I was talking a bit about how this seems like this smoking gun about hypocrisy on the right wing. And I think to a degree it is. I mean, like there is this like falling away of sort of obfuscation, right? And I think for a lot of us who pay a lot of attention to the media, we know that, Tucker Carlson knows what he's doing.
He does.
And
He really
Bill O'Reilly knew what he was doing, and Sean Hannity knows what he's doing. And they've got different goals, right? Like, they have different objectives personally, but they all know that they're engaging in acts of deception. And what's interesting about that is, on the quote left or in radical circles, there is this narrative of honesty, right? Where sort of being honest with one another is the foundation of trust, right? And there's this kind of narrative that exists. None of that exists on the right wing. And so you have this long history, I talk about Walter Lippmann a lot, but you have this long history kind of beginning with this embrace of neoclassicism in the 19th century up through Walter Lippmann, up through people like Whittaker Chambers and through people like William F. Buckley. And now into people like Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley and people like this. There's a through line here. And that through line is this through line of the hidden intellectual elite, right? It's not just that someone like William F. Buckley is a smart, influential person. It's that William F. Buckley is a smart, influential person because he exists in two different discourses at the same time. Or did. I mean, he's dead, obviously. But the first is this kind of external discourse, the discourse from National Review. What are they saying outside of their boundaries, right? How are they presenting themselves to the world? And if you go back and you look at old National Review conversations, for example, like the internal ones, many of which the documents have been published at this point, they very specifically talk about things like, how do we support the police in Selma, Alabama, after Bloody Sunday without looking racist? Right. And they just talk about this stuff like over letters and memos and all kinds of things. And there's like voluminous amounts of this stuff. Like, it's all over the place. Right. But then in private, of course, they're having relatively detailed strategic conversations about exactly that. Right. Here's what we really think. But how do we say this to people in a way that's not going to make us look like monsters? Right. And so Buckley, for example, when he ran for mayor of New York, that manifested as this, we just need police to solve the crime problem, which then he entirely attributed to a problem of black neighborhoods. It's not overtly Jim Crow, but it's really close. But it gave him enough plausible deniability to say, I'm not talking about racism. I'm just talking about crime. And this element of right-wing discourse, I think there are plenty of people on the quote left, specifically the liberal left, which labor under this delusion that if they just call conservatives out online for being hypocrites, then somehow that's just going to change everything. And maybe for your rank and file people, maybe every once in a while someone might have a moment of self-consciousness, but the reality is the people that are actually planning the strategies and mobilizing, they know exactly what they're doing. They've been doing it for generations. This is part of why William F. Buckley purged the John Birch Society out of the Republican Party, because they created this extremist element that prevented them from being able to obscure what they were really saying, because the John Birch Society would just say it, right? And that really prevented them from being able to say things. So for Trump is just saying things, right? Like, his whole brand is just saying stuff, and he says the quiet part out loud all the time. But for people like Sean Hannity, Laura Ingraham, Tucker Carlson, who have political projects that they're trying to undertake, this is why Trump's legacy becomes so important to them. Trump's legacy becomes the screen they hide behind. That they can go, here is this big, bombastic, giant, bright orange guy. Look at him. But behind the scenes, they're using him. And I think for those of us who have been paying attention to the Trumpian right for a while, I think that's become relatively clear. Trump is a figurehead. He is an image. But he's an image that shines brightly enough that you don't necessarily worry or even know about what a staffer on Paul Gosar's staff is saying in private, because there's no room for that, right? What we see in those text messages is we just see that really openly. Now, the big question becomes whether that matters, right? So many people on the right wing at this point, information in the right wing world has stopped being about verification and has started being about the source. So it's no longer about what the information is, it's about where the information comes from, right? If the information comes from a sympathetic place, then it's correct. If it comes from the New York Times, then it's wrong, regardless of what the information is. This has been an element of the religious right wing for a really long time, but that's become kind of generalized throughout the right. And when they do, quote, research, what that means is they go read blogs that they already agree with and then cite them, right? That culture is a post 9/11 phenomena in that way. It's a post internet age phenomena in that way. And they're able to mobilize all of that as long as they can maintain a bit of the veneer that really everything is okay, that things aren't falling apart, that things aren't collapsing, that everything is going really, really, really well, even if they know that that's not true. And so hypocrisy ceases to matter in a world in which the source of the information becomes more important than the content. Because, of course, if the source is something you agree with, they can never be hypocritical, just inherently, just logically. So it's a question of how much this is actually going to mean. I think, again, I always come back to this. Where this becomes meaningful is in that 15 to 20% of voters that live in that space where sometimes they vote Republican and sometimes they don't. That is really the space where this matters. And these kinds of events, these kinds of revelations are the kinds of things that create generational splits with whole demographics of people. Like where I grew up, the idea that anyone would vote Republican was unheard of. It just wasn't a thing. Nobody did it. Nobody knew any Republicans. It just wasn't a thing. That generational split is a result of the New Deal. You know, families like mine benefited really heavily from the New Deal, and therefore were lifelong Democrats as a result. Things like this, the stance the Republican Party took about the civil rights movement, for example, was one of these sort of fundamental breaking points. This open deception has the possibility of playing that role as well, in that it invalidates the entry point of any person into right-wing thought. That all of a sudden the entry point is always up for question. Because if the entry point can be shown to be part of an ecosystem in which deception is a fundamental part, then the entry point ceases to have validity. And that might ultimately be the long-term effect of something like this. It's not going to mean anything right now. But 10, 15, 20 years from now, in retrospect, this is one of those things that might have resonances that are hard to see today.
Yeah, no, I totally get what you're saying. I think the part where you talk about like the deception, I think a lot of people are also like, they're open to like that alternative universe, like people from QAnon waiting for JFK to arrive. Things that just like seem like extremely improbable and like, you know what I mean? Just like unrealistic, like not real. Fox News, like the fact that they got sued and Tucker Carlson was like, yeah, didn't they get sued? And they're like, it's okay. They're not wrong. They didn't lose. They won because no reasonable person would actually take what they're saying seriously. Yes, right. So it's like this whole notion of like, yeah, it's a lie and it's all been a lie. And so when we talk about those text messages, I'm gonna be straight up. I just think that like Hannity and Ingram didn't want to have to deal with like just like coding this over with like a lie and being like, oh wait, now we have to make up this new reality because every single time your kid tries to find out that Santa's real, you gotta just up the ante. I think that's also partially part of it. I think it's like they didn't want to have to get on there and be like, well, Antifa did it and they didn't have any evidence, right? And when you say when is this gonna matter, like I think that I don't think it's going to matter as long as these people are okay with living in an alternate universe. Like, right? I mean, I don't know. Yeah. I don't want to like mischaracterize what you said, but.
Well, I think there's a demographic question that comes into play.
The 15 and 20%
around
is
age.
very real. Yeah.
Well, and around age, right? So the right wing is just statistically older, right? Mm-hmm. And people are literally just dying off. I mean, this is happening in evangelical communities at large, right? And the conservative political movement at large. So they have to bring new people in, right? Mm-hmm. This is where I really think that this becomes relevant. Because of all of a sudden, and we saw this with the alt-right to a degree, right? The alt-right had this kind of moment in the sun. But when it became really, really clear that they were overtly, intentionally lying to everyone and thought it was really hilarious, their numbers dropped off, right? And it became really difficult to take anything that many of those people said seriously. And it cut off some of the entry point into that world, right? All of a sudden, the random person that's online, that's watching YouTube videos, if they do even just a little bit of research beyond that and scratch just below the surface and see, oh, this guy I was just watching on YouTube, really, here's all these other things about this person, and here's this like time when he was like joking about openly deceiving people. When you see that, it becomes a lot more difficult to sort of attach yourself to the source. Now, in the millennial generation, that radicalization process tends to happen on the internet. But for older generations, it doesn't. It tends to happen still on television, right? And still in the context of cable news. And so if all of a sudden that entry point gets cut off, if those people get invalidated outside of their world, all of a sudden it becomes much more difficult for people to enter that world. It becomes harder to find something persuasive in a world based on deception. And historically, movements that have resorted to conspiracy theories tend to collapse for this exact reason. They just become sort of epistemically unviable. They cease to be able to really say anything that's beyond sort of emotional reaction, right? And start to degrade and shrink over time rather than growing and maintaining inertia for that exact reason. Hopefully that's what happens as a result of this. But I don't know that the depths to which Americans, specifically white Americans, are willing to exist in worlds of absolute total delusion as a way to preserve white supremacy. I've still yet to find the limit of that and consistently go, wow, this has to be the limit. It can't get more ridiculous than this, and then it just does. Yeah. Right? So who really knows, you know?
Yeah, and I think that's like what I keep thinking, and like that's the scary part about it. It's just like it's like these people, like the reality of like living in like egalitarian society is like so terrifying. They'd rather just like put on like their AR. It's like they're gonna be like white people are gonna start wearing like AR machines. So like I just want to live in this reality that's not real. But when it comes to the text messages, the part that really does strike me is the fact that, like, after texting somebody to stop something and then you lie about it online, goes to show me that, like, you really think that the people who watch you are total fools. Like, you know what I mean? Like, they're gonna fall for it. And to me, that indicates that they know that they've brainwashed you to that point. It's like, you know how so many people have been brainwashed to believe in capitalism to the point when you say, like, basic stuff, like, people should have food. They're like, well, what if they don't work? Like, things that just wouldn't make any sense. Like, if you, like, were to, like, draw, like, just, like, cut that. So you think people deserve to starve because they don't want to work? And some people be like, well, yeah. Like, like, that sort of, like, brainwashing is possible. It's happened to most of us. So sure. I don't know.
Sure. Yeah. This is the scary sort of reality of the veil getting ripped away from American history. And I think that that's in a lot of ways what the uprising began the process of, right? There was all of a sudden this distinct inertia towards at least recognizing the history of the U.S. political project, right? At least not being able to just talk right past it. But the reaction to that was so ridiculously intense, right? I mean, that's where the whole, like, mythology of critical race theory being taught in elementary schools comes from. Like, critical race theories began as a discourse of legal scholars and became a political discourse after that. It is not something that gets taught in elementary school. So, like, there's absolutely zero evidence for that, right? And, like, they totally misuse that word. And for them now, critical race theory means that if a black person writes a book and you make my kids read it, like that, like that's like what it's been like whittled down to be. Like, they're banning books from like non-binary authors, and I'm like, wait, how did they get thrown into this? Like, what are you doing? While screaming that they're preserving their freedom at the same time. Like, that's the part that's just absolutely astonishing to me. But they think they are. I honestly think they think that they are preserving their freedom because they see how everybody who's not white is treated, and they're like, no, that cannot happen to us. You know what I mean? Like, it's not just these text messages, right? The January 6th Commission in general, like, that investigation has been kind of this gold mine for fringy parts of the right wing that gained currency within the mainstream, right? It wasn't just, this slideshow. It was also John Eastman from the Department of Justice trying to get Trump to appoint him as acting attorney general so he could overturn the election. It was Proud Boys and Oath Keepers working together to storm the Capitol. I mean, like, all of these things which, if one really pays attention to American history, seem incredibly logical. That the point where the reckoning with our history is to begin is absolutely going to be the point of the strongest reaction, right? And that all of these tendencies that create organizations like the Proud Boys are there already. I think what is difficult about a lot of this, though, for a lot of people, is trying to make sense of why. Not why those things are manifesting, but why they're being found to be persuasive when they become actual narratives, right? That they're not just coded, covert assertions that underlie the structure of how we live, right? But become actual positions that are affirmed. Like segregationism, like monarchism, right? Being a thing that's kind of rising in the right wing. Like, who's a monarchist?
That's so...
It's weird, right?
But again, it's just because they would do anything. They will do anything to preserve their privilege, like anything. And I haven't seen the bottom yet. As John Oliver always said, there is no bottom. And now we're just floating in the galaxy because we've went through the core of the earth and we've actually gone below. And like, I don't think there is a bottom. Like, I think that people are going to fight till the very, like, and like, if you think about even like with Reconstruction, like what happened with like when Black people were voting and they voted in like Black people, and like for the first time they were like Black representatives. Though the backlash from white people was so strong and so fast.
Yeah, I mean, it created the KKK. Like that backlash created the Klan. Yeah,
and Black people for the first time brought like public schools to like kids in the South. Like that wasn't free. Like, you know what I mean? They still didn't care.
Well, it risk improving the lives of poor white people as well. I mean, that's what's so funny about white supremacy is that by enough people backing this campaign of terror under the Klan, which was funded by ex-Confederates and wealthy landowners to basically turn back the clock, to basically push people back into being sharecroppers and making people money, they ensured that, their own dispossession as well. Like, some poor whites were barred from voting under the same things there's some of the same things that targeted recently freed blacks, during Reconstruction. And to the point where the federal government just kind of threw up their hands at a certain point and just said, screw it. Like, we don't want to deal with this crazy stuff going down in the South. And the Freedmen's Bureau was, basically folded, and then it moved into Jim Crow. And that whole, attempt at radically restructuring society post Civil War was a total failure. But I mean, that's why I think, one of the best things that Ram wrote, the Revolutionary Abolitionist movement, in their book, Burning Down the American Plantation, was this concept of the Civil War never ending, that these things continue to this day. And, that's very much so. And, you're talking about, people kicked off the voting rolls. I just saw as we were recording this that Martin Luther King's extended family is calling for no MLK celebrations this year until the Voting Rights Act is basically passed. So that's going to be interesting to see how liberals and progressives deal with that, and especially the Democratic Party, because, I mean, they love MLK Day.
Oh, yeah.
But that'll be interesting to see what happens with that. And but for sure they're going to continue to try to kick people off the rolls and redistrict. I mean, they're already doing that stuff as we speak.
Yeah, and I think a lot of this really comes down to something I pretty consistently try and remind myself of when I'm trying to think about things like this. And that is that there's a fundamental difference between the way that, say, operatives on the right wing act and their motivations, and the way that, say, liberal political operatives act. And it's not just about policy, and it's not just about aesthetics. It's really about something much more fundamental. And again, it goes back to this sort of fundamentally core intellectual elitism that forms the foundation of conservative politics in America, always has. It's that the right wing views discourse materially, and liberals don't. Mm. So in liberal discourses, it is really about ideas and debating ideas and trying to get people to agree on ideas. And what the right wing has realized is none of that means anything. That all of that sort of dynamic of agreement, that sort of structure of discourse are really manifestations of really material things. That the ideas are sort of a medium through which this materiality happens, right? But if you can just manipulate the ideas in such a way that you gain your material goals, it doesn't particularly matter what the ideas are. Right? Trumpism perfected that strategy. Absolutely perfected that strategy because unlike the people that came before him, Donald Trump has no ethics. Right? Even the people that came before him, though they were openly deceiving people, had lines about how far they're willing to go with that. They weren't willing to dive full blown into, for example, invalidating the entire electoral process. Right? That was a line too far. They weren't willing to go there. But for a very long time, I mean, I would even argue back to the Red Scare at the beginning of the 20th century, but definitely starting with McCarthyism. There is this clear sense in which mainstream elements of the right wing are willing to knowingly and overtly lie to large numbers of people to achieve a material goal, and are willing to do that unquestioningly. And that is something that liberals don't, at least intentionally, most of them do. Because again, the right wing views discourse materially, which, to be perfectly honest, that's also how, like, European radicals viewed discourse in the late 19th and early 20th century as well, right? Like, it's not an entirely unique view to the right wing, but, the way that that's been appropriated in America, when you add all of the other factors that sort of contribute to the way political dynamics here function, when you add in the willingness to be intentionally deceptive, all of a sudden you have a group of people that are using ideas as weapons purely and knowingly doing so. Right? That's really what we're seeing in those text messages, is we're seeing the weaponization of discourse knowingly and intentionally happening, right on the television, right in front of our eyes.
Yeah, like lying about something that they just that is unreal. I'm still utterly surprised. I guess I'm not surprised or shocked because we do this all the time, but you're right. I mean, they're more like, do you think part of it is also because they know that, their lies are more likely able to work with their constituents? Because liberals do, as you said, they do lie a lot also, but they lie about doing things and then not doing them. They don't actually, I feel like the big lie has already been done, right? Like the capitalism is great and it's working. Like that big lie, done, it's settled, good. So the liberals don't necessarily have to lie about that anymore. They just have to lie about trying to make things better, and then they don't. But they're not like lying about the actual reality of things beyond what the lie that already exists.
And I would argue it's qualitatively different in a couple of ways, right? Mm-hmm. First is that at least with liberals, there's this attempt to attach yourself to at least an interpretation of reality, right? So
there is. I agree with that. Yeah.
Like, I might have misstated the numbers here, but if you read this study, there's always this attempt to drop back to something, right? Like, there's still this assertion of some sort of linguistic legitimacy that exists in that world. That doesn't necessarily exist on the right anymore. But I think the other major difference, again, is about what they're trying to even achieve here, right? Liberals, and this is something Carl Schmitt talked about, as well, but liberalism as a politics, and liberalism in the European sense, right? Like in the liberal democratic sense, is fundamentally a fiction, right? It is the idea that the state can self-limit its own power, that sovereignty can use its sovereignty to limit the range of sovereignty, right? And all we need to see is something like what happened last year, to watch the rule of law completely fall apart, to watch a state of emergency sort of occur, right? That's all it took. right? It took riots in the streets, and the entire liberal democratic order essentially dissolved itself for a period of time, right?
It just like doesn't make any sense. If government created racism, why would they end it? Like,
Right.
what are you talking about? Like, they're not going to. What?
Yeah.
Like, sorry, please continue.
So liberals have this almost naive or utopian understanding of statism, where the state can be used for only good things, and that really what we're trying to do is we're trying to create this like progressive order of like good morality and blah, blah, blah. The right wing, on the other hand, specifically the sort of political operative wing of the right wing, understands state power very differently and always has. State power for the right wing involves things like imposing segregation. State power involves things like imposing religious morality around reproductive choices, right? Things like this, which are stunningly and obviously, quote, illiberal, right? That they are authoritarian, autocratic concepts that form the foundation of the conservative movement in this country.
And also of this country too, though, right? Like, that's,
yeah. And so on some level, it's not even that, you know, and this is kind of the second qualitative difference. It's not even that necessarily they have to, quote, lie in each individual data point they give. Instead, what happens in the conservative world is this entire ecosystem of obfuscation, right? They do lie, obviously. There's like disinformation campaigns happening all the time, specifically now, but more what they do is they employ argumentative tactics, which they train each other on. I mean, like the ecosystem of like right-wing internships and mentorship that exists in the DC area. A person like Katie McHugh, who, you know, was a writer for Breitbart and was the source for all those leaked emails from Stephen Miller, where he was citing like American Renaissance and stuff like that, and VDARE and things. One of the things that she talks a lot about is getting brought into DC as an intern at Breitbart, and within a week being at Peter Brimlow's house, who runs VDARE, meeting with Richard Spencer within a week, right? And that there's this entire ecosystem of these people that kind of exist. And so within that space, though, they use any tactic they can, and they can justify any tactic that they want to use based on this idea that what they're doing is trying to achieve some sort of universal human project, right? And they will do that through the use of, you know, whataboutism. You know, Sean Hannity is kind of the classic here. You know, you think Trump did this bad thing. What about this thing Hillary Clinton did, right? It's just like not even addressing it, just like completely shifting focus, right? They do this all the time. They do this through like the constant outrage machine. They do this through the misperception of whoever they consider to be adversaries. They do this by creating a sense of existential threat, right? All of these things are part of right-wing discourse. All of those things are ethically entirely unjustifiable and completely manipulative. But once you crest over into the idea that what you are doing is waging an existential struggle against people trying to destroy you, as, again, the Know Your Enemy podcast host said when they were talking about the National Conservatism Conference, the question we always need to ask ourselves when we're listening to these people is, what are they trying to justify doing? What are they trying to give themselves permission for? Right? And what does the narrative that they're putting forward allow them to do? And increasingly, the thing that's disturbing about the right wing is, as the rhetoric has overtaken the underlying elitist project, which is what's happened in the last 10 years, what we've been led into is we've been led into a discourse on the right wing which justifies eliminationism. Right? And that's incredibly dangerous. We only really need to look at what happened in Serbia in the mid-90s to understand what happens when eliminationism becomes a primary discourse on the right wing. It's incredibly devastating. And so we need to be paying attention to that, because for as much as these people think that they are still deceiving people and trying to achieve a project, what's happened is that the deception has overtaken the project at this point and has just become the politics. That's the part that's really terrifying.
Well, it's really scary too, because you do see it in action, with the extent of like how much like the Proud Boys are being militarized to like go into like local school boards. And sort of like create like this reality to fight this war that is happening.
Yeah, and that's how they view it too. They view it as a war.
Well, I mean, and the part is like I guess what I want to reiterate, and I feel like I've said this 10 times, that I do agree with you, and I think the part of it that is like scary about all this is like the extent to which we just always have to remember the extent to which white people are willing to go to protect white supremacy. And it could be within the intellectual behind the scenes, but it also requires people on the streets, and people are picking it up. And so the question for me is that, like, has this overtaken the project, or is this just like, maybe this is what we have to do now?
This has been the It's Going Down podcast. Check itsgoingdown.org for daily updates, columns, action reports, and news. Go to itsgoingdown.org/shop to support us, and follow us on all social media platforms. IGD, your daily resource for insurgent proletarian life.